Owen Hensley waited 5 years to dig up the truth. Everyone else tried to bury. His brother, Liam, had been left to die under the weight of a lie, an accident no one dared question. Now, one by one, the men who covered it up were being hunted, their bodies surfacing in the same river that hid their crime. Detective Sarah Morton knew she wasn't chasing just a killer. She was chasing vengeance that had been growing in the dark for years. In the quiet town of Riverside, where smiles hid secrets and the water whispered at night, Owen's return marked the beginning of something no one could stop. The dead were finally speaking, and the living were next. Riverside was the kind of town people moved to when they wanted peace. Rows of clean white houses stood beneath tall, swaying trees, and the sound of the river at night was the only thing that ever broke the silence. Children played on the streets until dusk, old men gathered near the cafe by the bridge, and everyone trusted one another. There hadn't been a major crime in over a decade, and most believed nothing bad ever could happen there. But what no one saw was that the calmness of Riverside had started to crack. Small, almost invisible signs appeared first. Pets vanishing without a trace, strange noises echoing through the night, and reports of lights flickering near the riverbank when no one was supposed to be there. It began in early spring, when the sun returned after months of rain. The town came alive again, and people took long walks along the riverside paths. But something felt different. There were whispers about a shadow that moved just beyond the streetlights, footsteps that seemed to follow late-night walkers, and an unfamiliar smell coming from the water when the wind blew. Everyone brushed it off as paranoia. Riverside had always been safe. No one wanted to be the first to admit that maybe it wasn't anymore. The police received their first report in April. A woman complained that her dog had been stolen from her yard. The gate left wide open. Days later, a cat was found mutilated behind a grocery store dumpster. Locals blamed foxes or teenagers trying to cause trouble, but quietly, people started locking their doors earlier than usual. The nights felt heavier, the kind of dark that pressed against the windows as if something was waiting outside. By May, the town's gossip had taken on a darker tone. Someone said they saw a figure standing by the old bridge at 3 a.m., staring into the river. Another swore they heard the sound of something being dragged through the woods behind their house. The local newspaper refused to print the rumors, calling them unverified stories fueled by fear. Yet the police patrols increased, and the mayor urged calm during a town meeting. Beneath the surface, anxiety was spreading like wildfire. Even the river seemed different. It had always been clear and calm, reflecting the town's quiet beauty. But now it carried a dull brown tint, and sometimes people claimed to see bubbles rise as if something large was moving beneath. Fishermen stopped going there. Teenagers who once gathered to drink by the banks found new hangouts farther from the water. Then came the power cuts, brief, unexplained blackouts that plunged entire streets into darkness. They lasted only minutes, but when the lights returned, residents spoke of seeing silhouettes outside their windows, watching and unmoving. No one could ever prove it, but everyone felt it. Riverside's peace was slipping away, replaced by an unease that no one could name. By the time summer began, the town had changed. The laughter that once filled its streets had grown quieter. People spoke in hushed tones and avoided the river entirely. They didn't know it yet, but something had already crossed the line from strange to deadly. The calm of Riverside had been broken forever, and the first body was only days away from being found. It was a Monday morning when everything changed. The sun had just started to rise, lighting up the calm surface of the river with golden reflections. A local jogger, a retired teacher named Henry Cole, followed his usual route along the bridge path. He noticed something unusual caught between the reeds. A large, dark suitcase half sunk in the water. At first, he thought it was just trash washed downstream after the recent rain, but when he got closer, he saw that the zipper was torn open and something pale was showing through. His steps slowed. For a moment, he tried to convince himself it was just a mannequin or a pile of fabric, but then he saw hair. Police arrived within minutes, sealing off the entire riverside. The suitcase was carefully lifted from the water, and what was inside silenced the crowd that had gathered nearby. Wrapped in plastic, cut into precise pieces, lay the remains of a man. Each piece was arranged with disturbing care, as if the killer had taken time to make sure it fit perfectly inside the bag. There was no blood in the suitcase. Whoever had done this knew how to clean a scene. Within hours, detectives identified the victim as Daniel Price, a 28-year-old electrician who lived alone in a small flat near the industrial park. He was quiet, polite, and rarely spoke to anyone outside of work. His employer said Daniel hadn't shown up for 2 days, but that wasn't unusual for him. He sometimes took off without notice. His coworkers described him as reserved, but dependable. Nothing about him seemed like someone who would end up dismembered in a river. Forensics examined the body and made a chilling discovery. There were no defensive wounds. Daniel hadn't fought back. It suggested he might have known his killer or been taken completely by surprise. There was also something strange missing. His wristwatch. It was a cheap silver one, the kind he wore every day, a gift from his late father. The rest of his belongings were untouched, including his wallet and phone, both found in his apartment. Only the watch was gone. Detectives searched Daniel's home but found no signs of forced entry. His fridge still held half-eaten food, his tools lay neatly arranged on the counter, and the bed was unmade, as if he'd planned to return. The only odd detail was a faint smell of bleach in the bathroom sink. It wasn't strong enough to be new. Whoever cleaned up had done it carefully and left no fingerprints behind. News of the murder spread through Riverside like wildfire. Residents stood behind police tape in silence, their faces pale and anxious. The town that once felt untouchable now had its first murder in decades. That night, the bridge was empty, the air colder than usual. People locked their doors and turned on every light. But somewhere in the distance, near the whispering river, something or someone was still watching. The killer had made their first move, and Riverside would never sleep peacefully again. In the days following Daniel Price's discovery, Riverside descended into quiet panic. The once friendly town turned cautious and suspicious. People who used to greet each other in the mornings now kept their eyes down and moved quickly along the streets. Parents stopped letting their children play outside. The shops near the river saw fewer customers, and the cafe that once buzzed with laughter now echoed with whispers. Fear had taken hold of the town like a fog that refused to lift. The police worked around the clock, setting up checkpoints and questioning residents, but nothing concrete surfaced. Security footage from around the bridge offered little help. The only shadow captured that night was a faint figure standing still near the water, too far away to identify. Detectives followed every lead that came in, but each one ended the same way, with silence. It was as though the killer had never existed. Then, just as the shock began to settle, another body appeared. 2 weeks after Daniel's murder, a warehouse worker unloading supplies behind an abandoned factory noticed a foul smell. Thinking it was a dead animal, he went to check and froze. Behind a rusted dumpster lay a body, partially covered with a tarp. The victim was a man in his 30s, his body showing the same methodical precision as Daniel's, cut cleanly, wrapped tightly, and missing one thing, a wristwatch. The police now knew they had a serial killer on their hands. The town that once prided itself on peace was suddenly a hunting ground. The second victim, identified as Martin Hughes, was a plumber who had lived in Riverside for most of his life. Like Daniel, he was quiet, kept to himself, and had no known enemies. But the similarities didn't end there. Martin and Daniel had both worked for the same construction company years earlier, a small firm called Riverfront Developments. When news of the second murder broke, the panic in Riverside turned into full-blown terror. People began leaving town, some without even packing. Those who stayed barricaded their homes at night. Social media pages filled with wild theories. Some said the killer was an outsider passing through. Others believed it was someone local, hiding in plain sight. The river, once a symbol of life and calm, became a place everyone avoided. Even the sound of flowing water felt sinister now. Local businesses suffered, schools shortened their hours, and every stranger became a suspect. Police cars roamed the streets day and night, their sirens cutting through the silence. Yet despite the constant presence of law enforcement, no one felt safe. The killer seemed invisible, moving without leaving a single trace. Detectives gathered at the station, staring at the photos of both victims pinned on the board. 2 men, 2 murders, both tied to the same company, both stripped of their watches. It was too specific to be coincidence. Somewhere within Riverside's quiet history, the truth was buried. But whoever was behind it wasn't finished. The pattern was only beginning, and the town's darkest days were still ahead. The investigation took a new turn when detectives began to focus on the strange connection between the 2 victims. Both Daniel Price and Martin Hughes had once worked for Riverfront Developments, a company that had been involved in building a line of luxury houses near the river almost 5 years earlier. At the time, the project had been celebrated as Riverside's biggest step toward modernization. But as the police dug through old records, they uncovered a long-forgotten tragedy buried beneath the project's polished image. 5 years ago, a construction worker named Liam Hensley had died on the job. According to the reports, it had been a freak accident. He was working late, operating heavy machinery, when a section of the ground gave way. Liam fell into an unsteady trench that collapsed on top of him before anyone could reach him. The company called it an unfortunate accident. The project was temporarily halted, and the site was eventually filled in. But something about the report seemed off. There were inconsistencies in the witness statements and gaps in the timeline. No one had questioned it back then. After all, accidents happen. Yet now, with 2 men dead and their bodies found in such a specific, deliberate manner, detectives began to suspect the past wasn't as innocent as it seemed. Detective Sarah Morton, who had been leading the case since Daniel's discovery, ordered a deeper review of the riverfront records. What they found was alarming. The official documents showed that several workers had been fired shortly after the accident, including both Daniel and Martin. Internal emails hinted at a cover-up, mentioning the need to keep things quiet and protect the company's image. When the police tried to contact the company's old owner, they discovered he had moved abroad years ago and refused to speak about the incident. The deeper the team dug, the darker the picture became. Liam Hensley's family had received no compensation, and most of the workers from that project had left Riverside soon after the accident. Only a few had stayed behind, living quiet, unremarkable lives, until they started dying. It was as if someone had been keeping track of every man involved, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Forensic specialists re-examined the remains of the victims and found a pattern that tied back to the construction site. The way the bodies were wrapped and arranged matched industrial packaging methods: plastic, duct tape and knots, similar to those used for securing materials on construction sites. The killer was leaving a message, one rooted in the past. When the news leaked that both murders might be connected to a forgotten workplace death, the town's fear deepened. People whispered about revenge, justice, and ghosts that refused to stay buried. Riverside had built its future on that riverbank, unaware that its foundation was soaked in guilt. The police realized this was no random violence. It was deliberate, personal, and planned. Someone hadn't forgotten what happened to Liam Hensley. Someone was making sure no one else did either. The tension in Riverside reached its peak when the killer struck again. But this time the victim lived. Peter Langley, a 45-year-old construction foreman, became the only known survivor of the person terrorizing the town. Like the others, Peter had worked on the Riverfront Developments project years ago, back when the so-called accident claimed Liam Hensley's life. He was one of the men who helped cover up the incident, though no one outside the old crew ever knew that. It happened late one evening in September. Peter was driving home after a long shift at a nearby site. The sky was dark, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. The roads outside town were quiet. lined with trees that seemed to swallow the headlights. As Peter approached a sharp bend near the river, his truck's headlights caught a glimpse of something in the middle of the road, a wooden crate. He slowed down, thinking it might have fallen off another vehicle, but before he could react, another car appeared out of nowhere, its headlights blinding him. The next moment, his truck swerved violently off the road and slammed into a ditch. When the police arrived, Peter was trembling and covered in cuts, but alive. He claimed he had seen someone standing by the roadside before the crash, a tall figure wearing a raincoat, holding something metallic that reflected in the headlights. But when officers searched the area, there was no sign of anyone, not even footprints. What they did find was strange, a trail of tire marks that stopped abruptly, as if the other vehicle had vanished into thin air. Peter was taken to the hospital, and an officer was assigned to watch over him. During questioning, he mentioned that a few days earlier he'd been receiving anonymous phone calls. Each time, the caller said nothing, just the sound of water flowing in the background. Sometimes it was followed by faint breathing. Peter had tried to ignore it, thinking it was a prank. Now, he wasn't so sure. The police placed him under temporary protection, but Peter refused to leave Riverside. He said he wouldn't run, that if the killer wanted him, they'd have to come face to face. He didn't admit it aloud, but guilt was eating him alive. The other workers might have tried to forget what they'd done to Liam Hensley, but Peter never truly had. Over the following nights, unmarked cars circled his home, and plainclothes officers stood watch from nearby houses. But whoever had attacked him didn't return. Still, strange things began to happen. Scratches appeared on his front door, his motion sensor lights kept flickering on, and one morning he found muddy footprints leading up to his back porch and stopping there. Detectives began to suspect that the killer was playing a game. The failed attack didn't seem like a mistake. It felt deliberate, as if meant to send a warning. Maybe Peter's survival wasn't an accident at all. Maybe the killer wanted him to live with fear, to remember every day what he'd buried years ago. Riverside had its first survivor, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the calm before something far worse. Detectives knew by now that the case wasn't about random murders. The precision, the pattern, the chosen victims. It all pointed toward revenge. Every lead they had circled back to one event, the death of Liam Hensley on the riverfront construction site 5 years earlier. But what truly happened that day had been buried, hidden under silence and guilt. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized the so-called accident was anything but. Old police records were vague, filled with incomplete notes and statements that didn't match up. Some workers claimed Liam fell into the trench by mistake. Others said he was alone when it happened. Yet one report mentioned a heated argument just hours before his death, though the names of those involved were never listed. Detective Sarah Morton tracked down the remaining crew members from the site. Some had moved away, others refused to speak, but one, a man named Edward Clark, finally broke his silence. His voice shook when he spoke. He said there had been a fight that night, a fight over stolen materials that someone had been selling on the side. Liam had discovered it and threatened to report everything to the authorities. Instead of facing exposure, the others tried to scare him into silence. Things got out of control. He was pushed, the trench collapsed, and by the time they tried to dig him out, it was too late. But the worst part wasn't the death, it was what they did after. Terrified of losing their jobs, they covered it up. They buried the rest of the site, forged the paperwork and told everyone it had been an accident. The company owner helped make it official, and the workers were paid off to keep quiet. Within months, the project was completed, and Liam's name was forgotten. Only his younger brother, Owen Hensley, never accepted the story. He had been 19 at the time, a quiet kid who vanished soon after the funeral. No one had heard from him since. Detectives pieced together what now seemed obvious. Owen had come back. The killer's knowledge of construction tools, the packaging materials, the precision all matched someone familiar with the trade. The missing watches suddenly made sense too. Each victim had been wearing one the night Liam died. part of a group gift the crew had bought together to celebrate the project's completion. The killer wasn't taking trophies, he was reclaiming symbols of their betrayal. Sarah Morton issued a warrant to re-examine the old riverfront site. Ground-penetrating scans revealed inconsistencies beneath the soil, as if something large had once been buried and later disturbed. It confirmed what Edward had said. Liam's body might never have been fully recovered. The case took on new urgency. Detectives warned the remaining men who had worked on that project to stay under pressure, but not everyone listened. Most believed Owen Hensley was long dead. Others thought it was impossible that one man could orchestrate such careful killings. They were wrong. The evidence was undeniable. Someone had spent years planning this, waiting patiently for the right time to finish what had started in that pit of dirt and lies. And now that time had come. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, in the form of a grainy CCTV recording from a hardware store just outside Riverside. Investigators had been reviewing hundreds of hours of footage, hoping to find a trace of anyone purchasing materials similar to those used in the murders: duct tape, plastic sheets, and industrial tools. One of the officers paused on a frame showing a man in a dark hooded jacket, his face partially hidden by a cap. He was tall, lean, and moved with a kind of deliberate calm that immediately drew attention. The man paid in cash, never looked at the cashier, and left within minutes. But it was his car that gave him away, a dark blue sedan registered under the name Owen Hensley. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Owen Hensley, the younger brother of Liam, the man whose death had started it all, was no longer just a shadow from the past. He was real, alive, and living less than an hour away under a false name. He had legally changed his identity 3 years earlier, listing his new occupation as a self-employed contractor. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and always keeping to himself. He lived in a modest apartment on the edge of an industrial district, rarely seen during the day but often coming and going late at night. When detectives raided his apartment, what they found confirmed every fear they had. Inside the small, dimly lit place were shelves lined with labeled boxes, tools, gloves, plastic wrap, cleaning agents. On the desk sat a map of Riverside marked with red pins, each one placed at the exact locations where the bodies had been found. But the most disturbing detail was on the far side of the room. A wooden table stood against the wall, and neatly arranged across it were 6 wristwatches. Each belonged to one of the dead men. Every watch was polished, their faces gleaming under the single overhead light. It wasn't a trophy display, it was a memorial, or perhaps a statement. Photos of Liam were taped above the watches. In one, Liam stood smiling with the very men now dead. The riverfront crew gathered together after finishing their final day on the site. The irony was suffocating. Written beneath the photo in red ink were the words, "They buried him alive." But Owen was gone. His car was missing, his phone left behind. A neighbor reported seeing him load something into his trunk 2 nights earlier, then drive off toward the old highway that led back to Riverside. Police flooded the area with patrols, but there was no trace. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The media caught wind of the story, and Riverside turned into a spectacle. Reporters called Owen a ghost of vengeance. The town split between fear and fascination. Some said he was doing what the law had failed to do, punishing those responsible. Others saw him as a monster no better than the men he killed. Detective Sarah Morton didn't see a monster or a hero. She saw a broken man consumed by grief and rage, someone who had waited years for justice and taken it into his own hands. But one thought haunted her. Owen's list wasn't finished. The map in his apartment had one red pin that hadn't been reached yet. Someone else was still marked. And somewhere out there, Owen was preparing for his final act. Before the police could close in, Owen Hensley disappeared completely. His car was found 2 days later, near the same river where Daniel Price's body had first been discovered. It was parked neatly by the roadside, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Inside, detectives found a folded note resting on the driver's seat. It contained only 6 words, written in smudged ink. They all buried him, not me. There were no fingerprints on the paper, no traces of blood, and no sign of a struggle. The river's edge showed a single set of footprints leading toward the water, stopping abruptly at the muddy bank. Divers searched for days, but no bodies surfaced. The current was strong, the water deep, and eventually the search was called off. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, no one believed it was over. Riverside tried to move on, though it never fully recovered. The killings had left scars that would not fade. Houses near the river went unsold. Businesses shut down, and at night the streets grew silent long before dark. People spoke of Owen Hensley in whispers, unsure whether to fear him or pity him. Some believed he was dead, washed away by the same river that had hidden his victims. Others swore they saw him walking the bridge at dawn, a lone figure in a hooded coat disappearing when approached. The legend of the river ghost became a part of Riverside's new identity, a story parents told their children to keep them indoors at night. Detective Sarah Morton stayed on the case long after it was officially archived. Something about it wouldn't let her rest. She reviewed the evidence repeatedly, searching for anything they might have missed. Every clue pointed to Owen, but some details didn't fit. There were inconsistencies in the timeline, traces suggesting another person might have helped him. The handwriting on the final note was shakier than the neat, deliberate script found in his apartment. It was as if someone had tried to imitate his words. Months later, construction began again near the river, part of a new government plan to rebuild the area's reputation. Workers clearing the site came across something buried deep in the soil, a large suitcase, almost identical to the one Daniel Price had been found in. This time, it contained only a single object, a watch. It didn't belong to any of the known victims. Etched on the back was a name the detectives hadn't seen before: Richard Vale, the former owner of Riverfront Developments. He had been living abroad, far from Riverside, and no one had heard from him in months. The discovery reignited the fear that the killings hadn't truly ended. Sarah visited the site herself, standing in the soft earth where the suitcase had been uncovered. The air was heavy, the river murmuring quietly beside her. Somewhere in that silence, she felt the same unease that had haunted her since the first body was found. If Owen Hensley had died, someone else had taken up his cause. Revenge had changed hands, passing like a curse. Riverside's peace would never return, not while the river still kept its secrets.